Some houses, meant to be safe havens, feel more like spaces of control. Muted walls, rigid layouts, furniture arranged for order rather than comfort, routines that leave no room for warmth, and the constant awareness of watchful eyes, not cameras, but glances that judge and assess. It's less a home and more a place where you're managed. This isn't just about appearances, it's about how an environment can quietly shape you. It plants unease, feeds self-doubt, and makes you measure every word and step. Over time you begin to second-guess your own feelings, wondering if the tension you sense is even real. When the atmosphere of a house begins to twist your perception and undermine your trust in yourself, it stops being a home in the true sense. That's when it becomes clear. The space around you needs to change, or you do. Gaslighting is one of those words that has slipped into everyday conversation, sometimes so casually that it risks losing its weight. People might use it to describe any disagreement, any misunderstanding, or even any moment when someone's memory differs from theirs. But the truth is that gaslighting is something far more precise, far more deliberate, and far more corrosive than a simple difference in recollection. It is a form of psychological manipulation, in which the goal is to make someone doubt their own perception of reality, what they see, what they hear, what they remember, even what they feel. The purpose is control, and when it works, it can quietly dismantle a person's confidence in their own mind, until they are dependent on someone else to tell them what's true. The term comes from a 1938 play called Gaslight, later made into a 1944 film in which a husband manipulates his wife into thinking she is losing her sanity. One of his methods is to dim the gas-powered lights in their home, and then deny that anything has changed when she notices. The power of this image, the slow flicker of light, and the insistent voice saying, "It hasn't dimmed at all, you're imagining things," is so vivid that it became shorthand for an entire category of abuse. And while the original story took place in the confines of a marriage, gaslighting now describes something that can occur in any kind of relationship, between partners, within families, in friendships, in workplaces, and even at the societal level. It often starts small. At first the distortions are tiny enough to pass as misunderstandings. Someone might deny saying something you are certain you heard, and you brush it off as a slip of memory. Or they might tell you that your emotional reaction is too much, and you wonder if maybe they're right. The manipulator counts on this hesitation, on the fact that most people would rather avoid conflict than push to defend their own recollection of events. Over time the denials and minimizations pile up. What was once a momentary doubt becomes a pattern. You begin to notice that every disagreement ends with you conceding, not because you were convinced, but because you're too exhausted to keep insisting on your version of events. It can escalate in subtle ways. Imagine a conversation about something mundane, a plan you made last week, a comment someone made at dinner, a task that was supposed to be completed. You recall it one way, the other person recalls it differently. In a healthy exchange, you might check calendars, or talk it through until you figure out where the misunderstanding happened. In gaslighting, there is no search for clarity. There is only the unshakable insistence from the other person that their version is the truth, and the equally unshakable dismissal of yours. That never happened. You must be imagining it. You're remembering wrong. You hear it enough, and eventually the words stop being a challenge you resist, and become a rhythm you internalize. Maria's story is a familiar example. She grew up in a home where the kitchen table was the center of family life. One evening, her father made a joke about her weight, sharp enough to sting, sharp enough to make her brother laugh, and her mother quickly changed the subject. Hours later, Maria went to her mother and said the remark had hurt her. Her mother's response was soft, almost comforting. "Oh honey, he didn't mean it that way, you're just sensitive. And besides, I don't think he even said that." Maria knew she had heard it. She could replay the moment in her mind as clearly as if it were on video. But her mother's certainty made her own memory wobble. Was she making too much of it? Was she misremembering? It wasn't the first time she'd had this experience, and by the time she left home for college, she had learned to question herself before she questioned anyone else. Gaslighting is effective because it exploits a basic human instinct, the desire for social harmony, especially with those we are closest to. We are more likely to doubt our own judgment than to believe that someone we trust might be distorting reality. This is particularly true in environments where that person holds some kind of authority, parent over child, boss over employee, older sibling over younger. The imbalance in power makes it easier for their version of events to override yours. The erosion of self-trust doesn't happen overnight. Think of it like a slow leak in a tire. At first you can still drive, you can still steer, but mile after mile, the pressure drops until one day you realize the rim is scraping the road. That's what gaslighting does to your sense of reality. It slowly drains the certainty from it, and by the time you notice, you may have been running on empty for years. Jamie's experience at university shows how it can happen outside of family or romantic relationships. She lived in a shared apartment with 3 friends. In the beginning, everything seemed fine. But little by little, discrepancies started to appear. Groceries she had bought would disappear, and when she mentioned it, her roommates laughed and said she must be imagining things. The thermostat would be set much lower than she liked, and when she complained, they swore it had been that way for weeks. Each time she questioned something, she was met with a united front insisting her perception was wrong. Eventually, Jamie stopped bringing things up. By the end of the year, she was hesitant to trust her instincts in completely unrelated areas of her life. Proof that the effects of gaslighting don't stay neatly contained in the space where they happen. One of the most dangerous stages is when the manipulator no longer needs to correct you because you do it yourself. Internalized gaslighting means you've absorbed the message so thoroughly that you preemptively adjust your thoughts and words to match the dominant narrative. You dismiss your own emotions before anyone else gets the chance. You rewrite your own memories before someone else tells you to. At that point, the damage is self-sustaining. In the context of home, where the people involved are often those you see most, and the environment is supposed to be a place of rest, the impact is amplified. You can leave a job at the end of the day, or walk away from a social group that makes you feel small. When the gaslighting happens in your home, there is no natural break. The space itself becomes saturated with the pattern, until even its walls and rooms feel like part of the manipulation. And that's where the idea of your house gaslighting you takes shape, not as a building with intentions, but as an environment woven so tightly with distortion that it begins to feel like the air you breathe. In the next part of this journey, we'll take that metaphor seriously and look at how a home, as a physical space, and as a collection of relationships, can become an accomplice in the process of gaslighting. When we talk about gaslighting, we almost always picture it as something people do to other people, a manipulator and a target, words exchanged, moments rewritten, memories denied. But a home, the place you sleep, eat, breathe, and return to day after day, can be part of that process in ways that are harder to name. Of course, bricks and wood can't form intentions. They don't plot, scheme, or speak. Yet a house is not just an inert shell. It is a container for the people, routines, and emotional currents within it. Those things can seep into the walls in a way that makes the space itself feel complicit. Think of it like an echo chamber. In a healthy home, the echoes you hear affirm your sense of reality. If you remember something, it's discussed. If you feel something, it's considered. In a gaslighting home, the echoes are warped. They carry someone else's version of events back to you over and over, until your own voice sounds unfamiliar. You might walk into the kitchen and feel a flicker of dread without knowing why, or find yourself avoiding certain rooms because they seem to hum with the memory of past dismissals. This dissonance often hides behind a perfectly ordinary exterior. The lawn may be neatly cut, the curtains clean, the smell of fresh bread wafting from the oven when guests arrive. Friends who drop by comment on how warm and welcoming it all feels. And yet for you, the same couch they sink into with relief is the place you sat through conversations that left you doubting your own sanity. The same dining table that hosts friendly dinners has also been the site of quiet erasures, moments when your words or feelings were subtly rewritten in front of everyone. The mixed signals are part of what makes it so destabilizing. We expect visual cues and emotional cues to line up. Cozy rooms should bring comfort, familiar spaces should bring safety. When the cues conflict, when the cozy room is also the place where your reality is consistently questioned, your mind works overtime to reconcile the contradiction. That extra cognitive load is exhausting, and over months or years it erodes your trust in your gut instincts. Power dynamics shape how this plays out. In some households, there is a clear authority figure, whose view trumps all others. In others, the hierarchy is quieter, based on age, personality, or long-established roles. In either case, challenging the dominant narrative can be risky. Sometimes the consequences are obvious, raised voices, icy silences, and sometimes they're subtle, like being left out of future decisions or conversations. The more these consequences repeat, the more you learn that survival in this space depends on agreement, even if agreement means betraying what you know to be true. Consider the Parker family. Their house is the picture of suburban success. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a yard with just so flower beds. Inside, everything is in its place, and their neighbors admire the order. Lily, the teenage daughter, knows a different version. Her father makes cutting remarks about her friends or appearance, always with a chuckle, always framed as humor. Her mother tells her she's overreacting if she tries to object. On the rare occasions Lily presses the point, both parents insist she's remembering wrong. When friends visit, the family laughs and jokes together, the rooms warm with hospitality. But as soon as the door closes behind the guests, the warmth fades. Lily is left wondering if she imagined the change, and over time she starts to believe that maybe her perceptions really can't be trusted. The house becomes a stage on which this drama plays out, the set dressing perfect, the emotional script corrosive. The physical space reinforces the dynamic because it is inescapable. You can leave a toxic office at 5 p.m., but home is where you are supposed to rest, to be off guard. If the air inside carries the tension of constant low-grade denial, there is no off switch. Even in quiet moments, the association lingers, the smell of coffee reminding you of mornings when your words were twisted, the creak of a floorboard echoing a night when your version of events was laughed off. When you start to see your home in this way, as a place where the environment itself has been enlisted in the gaslighting, the awareness can be both clarifying and painful. Clarifying because it names something you may have felt for years, painful because it means the place you thought of as your refuge is also the place that has been undermining you. That recognition is the first step toward change, but it also raises hard questions. How do you reclaim a space that has been used against you? How do you draw boundaries when the walls themselves feel like they've absorbed the conflict? Those are questions we'll keep unfolding, but first it's worth slowing down to notice the specific patterns that reveal a home has become part of the gaslighting process. In the next section, we'll move from the broad metaphor to the telltale signs you can watch for in your own life. Realizing that the home you live in might be reinforcing or even participating in gaslighting rarely happens all at once. More often, it's an awareness that creeps in around the edges, like noticing the faint scent of something burning long before you see any smoke. It might begin with a single moment of unease, a conversation that leaves you confused, a familiar room that suddenly feels alien. But because home is supposed to be the one place you can rely on, you're likely to dismiss that feeling as stress, tiredness, or your imagination. And that dismissal is part of the trap. The signs reveal themselves slowly, and each one on its own might seem harmless or explainable. You tell yourself everyone forgets details sometimes. That tone can be misread, that maybe you are more sensitive than others. But the thread connecting all these small incidents is the way they leave you questioning yourself more than the situation. When you begin to notice that, you're beginning to notice the architecture of the problem. One of the most common signs is the steady erosion of confidence in your own memory. You may be certain you left your phone on the table, but when it turns up somewhere else and someone insists you must have put it there, you hesitate. Maybe they're right. You may recall a conversation word for word, but when the person you spoke to insists it happened differently, or not at all, a seed of doubt takes root. At first you might fight to hold on to your version, but over time the friction of defending yourself wears you down. Eventually you find yourself doubting before the other person even responds. The dismissal of feelings is another thread that runs through these households. Imagine coming home after a difficult day and telling someone you feel upset about something that happened at work. Instead of listening, they tell you you're overreacting, or that it's not worth getting worked up about, or that you should toughen up. These phrases are not just unkind, they chip away at the idea that your emotions are trustworthy indicators of your own experience. If you hear them often enough, you might begin to run your feelings through an internal filter before expressing them, wondering if they are valid at all. The denial of events is perhaps the most disorienting piece. It's one thing to have your feelings questioned, it's another to have the facts themselves erased. This might take the form of someone telling you a conversation never happened, that a promise was never made, or that you agreed to something you know you refused. In these moments, your mind scrambles to reconcile what you remember with what you are being told. And because the person denying it is someone you live with, someone you see daily, it becomes harder to imagine that they could be wrong or misleading you, so you adjust your own memory to match theirs, even when it means betraying what you know. The emotional cost of speaking up becomes a deterrent of its own. If every attempt to express concern is met with defensiveness, mockery, or a swift change of subject, you learn to keep those concerns to yourself. It isn't worth the tension. This avoidance might feel like a form of peacekeeping at first, but over time it shrinks the space you occupy in your own home. You begin to disappear in small ways by staying silent, by minimizing your needs, by editing your thoughts before they leave your mouth. Jamie's experience at university is one example of how quickly this can take root. She lived with 3 friends off campus, and in the beginning it felt like a comfortable arrangement. But small things began to happen, her groceries disappearing, the thermostat set differently than she preferred. When she mentioned these changes, her roommates laughed, telling her she was imagining it. The more she brought up, the more united they became in their version of reality, one that painted her as forgetful or overly picky. After a few months, Jamie stopped mentioning these things altogether. By the end of the year she noticed she was doubting herself in entirely unrelated situations, hesitating to speak up in class, second-guessing her instincts about other people. The apartment, with its shared spaces and collective denials, had trained her to expect that her reality would be challenged. Sometimes the most telling sign isn't in the arguments or the denials, but in the contrast between how you feel inside the house and how you feel when you're away from it. You might notice that you breathe easier, speak more freely, or feel lighter when you're at work, visiting friends, or even running errands. Then as you approach home, the old heaviness creeps back in. This shift is not just about the people, it's about the atmosphere, the accumulated associations embedded in the space. If the air inside your own home carries the weight of constant doubt, it can become a place where you are never fully at rest. In some cases, the loss of expectation is complete. You stop hoping to be understood. You might still share your thoughts, but without the underlying belief that they will be met with empathy. And when understanding becomes rare enough, you adapt by revealing less and less of yourself. Your voice gets quieter, your opinions more tentative. In that silence, the dominant narrative of the household grows stronger, because there is nothing left to counter it. Recognizing these signs can be painful. It means acknowledging that the space you depend on for safety has been undermining you. It forces you to rethink the meaning of home, and to confront the gap between what you thought it was and what it has actually been. But there is strength in naming it. Once you can identify the ways your environment has been shaping your sense of reality, you can begin to push back, first in small ways, and then if you choose in larger ones. That's where we'll go next, into the psychology of why home-based gaslighting works so well, how it reshapes your brain over time, and why the patterns can be so difficult to break, even long after you've left the environment. Gaslighting that happens within the home works differently from the kind that might occur in a workplace, a friendship, or even a short-lived romantic relationship. It has a unique power because the home is not just where you live, it is where your mind rests, where your body recharges, where you are supposed to let down your guard. When the very space that should offer safety becomes a place where your reality is questioned, the impact is deeper and more lasting than you might realize in the moment. Part of the reason it works so effectively lies in the way our brains are wired for trust and belonging. From early childhood, we are taught to look to the people around us for cues about what is real and what is safe. In a nurturing environment, those cues reinforce our own perceptions. A parent sees that we are upset and validates it. A partner hears our recollection of a conversation and is willing to compare notes. A roommate notices that something in the house is broken and agrees that it needs to be fixed. These exchanges build confidence not only in the relationship, but also in our own capacity to judge reality. But in a gaslighting environment, the cues are inconsistent or deliberately misleading. Sometimes your version of events is accepted, sometimes it is quietly dismissed, sometimes it is turned upside down. This inconsistency is destabilizing because it keeps you guessing. You can't build a reliable internal compass when the magnetic pull of the household reality is constantly shifting. What's more, home-based gaslighting is continuous. A manipulative boss can only reach you during work hours. A toxic friend can only undermine you when you spend time together. But the home is ever present. Even when no one is actively challenging your perception, the environment is saturated with the memory of those moments. The familiar sound of the front door closing might remind you of nights when you were accused of overreacting. The smell of a certain meal might call back to a dinner when a story you told was openly mocked or denied. The physical environment becomes a sensory map of invalidation. This sensory aspect is one of the most overlooked parts of home-based gaslighting. Our brains link experiences to sights, sounds, smells, and textures. A particular lamp in the living room might bring back the memory of a tense argument that ended with your feelings being dismissed. The hallway outside your bedroom might carry the echo of a conversation where you were told your memory was wrong. These associations can trigger a physical reaction, tension in your shoulders, a faster heartbeat, before you've even consciously recalled the event. The body remembers even when the mind has tried to move on. Mixed signals make the process even more insidious. In some moments, the people in your home might be affectionate, supportive, even loving. In other moments, they deny your experience entirely. The brain struggles to reconcile these two realities, and because we are biologically inclined to preserve relationships, especially with those we depend on, we often choose the interpretation that allows us to maintain closeness, even if it means discarding our own truth. This is why gaslighting can become an intergenerational pattern. A child raised in such an environment learns to ignore their instincts in favor of the dominant household narrative. If that child grows up and starts a family of their own without ever questioning this pattern, they may unconsciously pass it on. They might think they are keeping the peace by brushing off a partner's complaint or a child's emotional reaction, when in fact they are repeating the same dynamic they endured. The brain adapts to chronic gaslighting by developing what psychologists sometimes call doubt loops, mental habits in which every strong perception or feeling is immediately followed by a wave of second-guessing. Did that really happen? Did I overreact? Am I misremembering? These loops can become automatic, kicking in before you even finish the thought you are questioning. Over time they erode the mental shortcuts you rely on to navigate daily life, replacing them with constant self-surveillance. Priya's experience shows how early exposure to gaslighting can ripple through a lifetime. As a child, if she remembered her father raising his voice at dinner, her mother would gently tell her that he had only been speaking firmly, that she was exaggerating. If she pointed out that the argument had been loud enough for the neighbors to hear, her parents would shake their heads and say she was mistaken. By the time Priya was in her late 20s, she found herself hesitating to act on her instincts in unrelated areas, at work, in friendships, even in grocery store interactions. The internal voice that should have said, "You know what you saw," was instead whispering, "Are you sure?" Breaking this conditioning is difficult, because the cues that sustain it are everywhere. They are in the layout of the house, the sound of familiar footsteps, the rituals that mark each day. Even after leaving the environment, the mental patterns can persist. A phrase, a smell, a certain time of day can pull you back into the mindset you lived in for years. Healing requires not only challenging the narratives you were given, but also reshaping the associations you have with the space around you, or if possible, creating entirely new spaces where your reality is not under constant review. This is the double bind of home-based gaslighting. It uses the constancy of the home to destabilize you, and then it uses your attachment to that constancy to keep you from questioning it. Recognizing this interplay is the first step toward dismantling its hold, but the process of doing so takes time, deliberate effort, and often help from outside the environment. When we think of home, we often imagine its physical aspects first: the walls, the furniture, the lighting, the arrangement of rooms. But the physical space of a home is never just a backdrop. It is a living archive of the experiences that happen within it. The color of a wall is not just a color. It's the color that was there the day you were told you had imagined a conversation. The couch is not just where you sit. It's where you once tried to bring up a hurtful incident and were told you were making things up. Over time, the objects, layouts, and sounds of the house become saturated with meaning, and when that meaning is tied to gaslighting, it can hold you in place in ways you don't expect. Physical design and emotional climate are in constant conversation. A home that is bright, open, and filled with inviting places to talk can encourage open dialogue. But a home where the only common space is dominated by a single person's preferences, where others feel like guests in their own living room, can quietly reinforce a hierarchy of whose reality matters. The arrangement of space can dictate who speaks and who stays silent. A kitchen table placed so that one person commands the view of the room may become a stage for conversations where that person's version of events prevails, while others are left feeling as though they are on trial. The way sound travels in a house also shapes the experience of living in it. If walls are thin and doors don't shut properly, private conversations may never feel fully private. In a gaslighting household, this can mean that any attempt to confide in one person can be overheard, commented on, or later used in a way that distorts the original context. The creak of a floorboard outside your door might be enough to remind you that your words are never truly safe, and you might begin to edit yourself, even when you're alone. Lighting too plays its part. Harsh overhead lighting can make spaces feel interrogative, while dim lighting can blur details and make it harder to read expressions or see small changes in the environment. In a home where reality is often disputed, even something as simple as the level of light can become another layer of uncertainty. Was that expression you saw on someone's face a flash of anger, or was it just a shadow? Did the light flicker because of a fault in the bulb, or because someone adjusted it to unsettle you? These questions may seem small, but their cumulative effect is to make you less sure of your own senses. The objects in a home can be enlisted into the work of gaslighting as well. Personal items might be moved, altered, or borrowed without your knowledge, then returned in ways that make you question whether you misplaced them. A book you know was on the coffee table might turn up in your bedroom, and when you mention it, you're told it was always there. Over time, this manipulation of physical evidence teaches you that your perceptions are unreliable, that even what you can touch and see may not be trustworthy. Marisol's story shows how deeply the physical and emotional layers of a home can become entwined. After moving in with her partner, she noticed small changes: a favorite mug going missing, a window left open when she was sure she had closed it. At first she chalked these up to forgetfulness. But when she mentioned them, her partner would respond with exaggerated surprise, insisting she was always losing track of things. As the months went by, Marisol found herself scanning the apartment each time she came home, mentally noting the position of objects so she could be certain later. This constant monitoring made her feel on edge, and that unease became part of the apartment itself. Even after she left, she said that photographs of the space could bring back the sensation of having to defend what she knew to be true. Smell can also be a trigger in ways people underestimate. A particular perfume, the scent of a certain meal, or even the mustiness of a closed-up room can be linked to moments when your feelings or memories were denied. These sensory triggers can bypass your conscious mind entirely, producing a wave of anxiety or doubt before you've even named the association. Because scent is tied so strongly to memory, it can make the past feel immediate, keeping old gaslighting dynamics alive in the present. In a healthy home, the physical environment reinforces trust. Items stay where you leave them unless someone tells you they've moved them. Lighting and sound support comfort and communication. The layout encourages movement, conversation, and connection rather than control. But in a gaslighting home, these same elements are manipulated or allowed to decay in ways that subtly undermine your sense of reality. The home becomes not just a stage for gaslighting, but a co-conspirator, its very structure bending to support the distortion. When the physical space carries so much weight in the gaslighting dynamic, reclaiming it, or leaving it, can be a powerful step in recovery. Some people find that rearranging furniture, changing wall colors, or replacing certain objects helps to strip away their associations with the old patterns. Others discover that they cannot relax in a space that has been steeped in distortion, no matter how much they change it, and that moving to a new environment is the only way to truly breathe again. There is no single right approach, but in either case, recognizing the role the home itself has played is essential. Living for a prolonged period in a home that undermines your perception of reality changes you in ways that are both visible and invisible. The visible effects might be easier to spot from the outside. You may seem quieter, more hesitant to speak up, less likely to initiate a disagreement. Friends might notice you deferring to certain people in your household, or avoiding topics you once discussed freely. But the invisible effects run much deeper, shaping how you think, how you feel, and how you respond to the world long after you've left the environment. One of the most immediate psychological consequences is the erosion of self-trust. Gaslighting works by introducing doubt into every certainty, by replacing confidence with hesitation. Over time, the mental reflex to check, recheck, and second-guess becomes automatic. You might replay conversations in your head repeatedly, looking for the moment you could have misheard. You might scrutinize your own memories, wondering if you added details that were never there. This constant mental auditing takes energy that could have gone into creativity, problem-solving, or simply enjoying your life. The exhaustion from this constant doubt is compounded by hypervigilance. In a gaslighting home, you learn to scan the emotional weather of the space before you speak or act. You may walk into a room and instinctively read every facial expression, tone of voice, or subtle shift in posture to gauge whether it's safe to bring up a topic or make a request. Hypervigilance can feel like a superpower at first. You become adept at anticipating reactions, but it comes at a steep cost. Your nervous system stays on high alert, flooding your body with stress hormones. Over time, this can lead to sleep disturbances, digestive issues, chronic headaches, and other stress-related health problems. Another long-term toll is the distortion of emotional boundaries. In a healthy environment, you learn where you end and others begin. You can hold on to your own perspective, even when someone else disagrees. But in a gaslighting household, your perspective is repeatedly overridden. You may start to blur the line between your feelings and those of the dominant voice in the house. This can lead to a kind of emotional codependency, where you calibrate your reality according to their reactions, even when those reactions contradict your own experience. Isolation is another common adaptation. though it may not look like isolation in the traditional sense. You might still see friends and family, but you start to withhold certain truths from them. This isn't because you don't trust them. It's because you've learned that talking about what happens at home leads to more trouble. Maybe your confidants don't understand and dismiss your concerns. Maybe the person in your home hears about the conversation and uses it as further evidence that you are exaggerating or betraying them. Slowly, you learn to keep more and more to yourself, which leaves you without external validation when you most need it. One of the subtler effects is the gradual lowering of your expectations for how you should be treated. What once would have felt like an unacceptable dismissal of your feelings begins to feel normal. You adapt to the rhythm of invalidation, and in doing so you start to normalize it. This can make it hard to recognize healthier dynamics when you encounter them. Someone who listens to you without interrupting, or who validates your perception without trying to rewrite it, might feel suspicious, or even unsettling at first because it's unfamiliar. The coping strategies people develop in such environments often serve them in the short term but can be harmful in the long term. Some become chronic appeasers, smoothing over conflicts and agreeing even when they disagree internally. Others develop an overly rigid attachment to their own perspective, unable to consider alternate viewpoints without feeling threatened, a defensive posture born from having their viewpoint constantly challenged in bad faith. Still others retreat inward, creating a rich inner life that no one else can touch, but at the cost of deep connection. Consider the case of Jordan, who grew up in a household where any disagreement with his father's version of events was met with ridicule. As a teenager, Jordan learned to preface every statement with qualifiers. I might be wrong but, or this could just be me. But, he found that these softened the blow, and reduced the chance of outright dismissal. By the time he was in his 30s, this verbal habit was so ingrained that it affected his professional life. Colleagues perceived him as lacking confidence, even when his ideas were solid. It took years of therapy for him to recognize that the habit had been a survival mechanism, one that no longer served him outside the family home. The psychological toll of living in a gaslighting household doesn't end when you walk out the door for good. Many people find that they carry the patterns with them into new environments, reacting to neutral situations as if they were still in the old dynamic. A friend forgetting to text back can trigger the same feelings as a deliberate act of dismissal. A partner questioning a memory can feel like the first step toward a larger campaign of distortion. This is why recovery requires more than just physical distance. It demands the slow rebuilding of self-trust, the relearning of boundaries, and the conscious exposure to environments where your perception is valued rather than undermined. Over years of living in a home where your reality is questioned, your identity does not simply remain untouched with a few dents and scratches. It is subtly reformed layer by layer into something shaped as much by the distortion as by your own original self. This reshaping happens gradually, almost imperceptibly, until the way you see yourself, other people, and the world at large carries the fingerprints of the environment you've been surviving in. One of the most profound changes is in how you define truth. In a healthy household, truth feels like a solid floor. It might be discussed, interpreted, even debated, but it is fundamentally stable. In a gaslighting household, truth is fluid, shifting according to the needs or moods of those in control. You adapt by learning that truth is not what you saw, heard, or felt, but what is permitted to stand uncontested. Over time, this erodes the belief that facts have an independent existence outside of relationships, and instead you come to associate truth with the version of reality that will keep the peace. This shift has a ripple effect on self-identity. If what's real is determined by someone else's approval, then who you are is also up for negotiation. You may learn to adjust your personality traits, becoming less outspoken, more agreeable, or more self-effacing, in order to match the version of yourself that is most likely to be accepted. At first, these adjustments may feel like small compromises, but over years they can lead to a sense that you no longer know who you are outside of the home's feedback loop. Maya's story illustrates this vividly. She grew up being told she was too sensitive whenever she expressed hurt. Eventually, she began to preemptively edit her emotions, downplaying them, even in her own mind before anyone else had the chance to. By her mid-20s, she realized she struggled to answer simple questions like, "What do you like?" or "What's your opinion on this?" Because she had trained herself to scan for the right response rather than the honest one. Her sense of identity had been whittled down to what was safest, leaving her unsure of what she actually thought or felt. A gaslighting household also reshapes your understanding of conflict. Instead of viewing disagreements as a natural part of human interaction, you may come to see them as dangerous events with unpredictable outcomes. Because challenging the dominant narrative in your home often led to dismissal, ridicule, or escalation, your mind learns to treat disagreement as a threat to your stability. This can result in a lifelong avoidance of conflict, even when avoidance means allowing harmful situations to persist. The worldview that emerges from such a home is often tinged with an underlying wariness toward people's intentions. You may find yourself instinctively questioning whether others mean what they say, whether they are leaving out crucial information, or whether their friendliness is a precursor to manipulation. This is not paranoia in the exaggerated sense, but a survival-based skepticism born of repeated experiences in which stated intentions and actual actions did not match. There's also the impact on how you process memory. In a stable environment, memory serves as a reliable record, something you can reference to make sense of the present and guide your decisions. In a gaslighting home, where your memories are often challenged or rewritten, you learn that remembering too vividly can be a liability. You might begin to hold your memories loosely, telling yourself, "I think that happened, but I could be wrong," even about events you know were real. Over time, this uncertainty can make you more susceptible to accepting alternate versions of events, not just in your home, but in other contexts as well. Perhaps the most far-reaching reshaping happens in your perception of your own worth. When your feelings, thoughts, and observations are routinely invalidated, you internalize the idea that your internal world is less important, less accurate, or less legitimate than that of others. This belief can influence every relationship you enter, leading you to choose partners, friends, or even workplaces that mirror the same imbalance of power you knew at home. You might accept treatment you don't deserve, because part of you believes it's the best you can expect. This internalization of diminished worth can persist even when external circumstances change. Someone might escape the gaslighting household, move into a supportive environment, and still carry the reflex to defer, to minimize their own needs, to doubt their own insight. It's not that they consciously want to keep living by those old rules, it's that the rules have become the framework through which they interpret the world. Overcoming this identity reshaping is not a matter of simply deciding to be yourself again, because the self that existed before the gaslighting may feel distant, undeveloped, or even hypothetical. Recovery involves experimentation, trying out preferences, opinions, and boundaries to see which ones feel authentic without the filter of the old environment. It requires environments where dissent is safe, where memories are respected, where truth is not contingent on someone else's comfort. Over time, as these new experiences accumulate, they begin to rewrite the self-image that gaslighting distorted, replacing it with something steadier, truer, and genuinely your own. In a home where your perceptions are constantly called into question, survival depends on adaptation. These adaptations are often instinctive at first, born out of the immediate need to avoid conflict, preserve a sense of stability, or simply make it through the day with the least emotional harm possible. Over time, they become ingrained patterns, coping mechanisms that feel like second nature. While they may help you navigate the gaslighting environment, they often linger long after you've left, shaping how you interact with others and how you relate to yourself. One of the most common coping strategies is what could be called strategic silence. This isn't the quiet of shyness or lack of interest, but a calculated withholding of thoughts and feelings to prevent them from being twisted or dismissed. In a gaslighting household, every admission or vulnerability can become ammunition in the next dispute, so you learn to keep your emotional cards close to your chest. At first, this can feel like an act of self-protection, a way to control what is exposed, but as the years pass, it can leave you feeling emotionally isolated, even when you are surrounded by people who might be safe to open up to. Another adaptation is the development of hypercompetence. In an environment where mistakes are magnified, remembered, and sometimes fabricated, you learn to anticipate every possible criticism. This might mean double and triple checking tasks, rehearsing conversations in advance, or creating meticulous systems to track details so that your version of events is harder to dispute. While this level of thoroughness can serve you in certain professional or personal contexts, it is exhausting, and it can make it difficult to relax. Even in situations where mistakes are not catastrophic, you may find yourself unable to tolerate imperfection because you've internalized the belief that even small errors will be used to undermine you. Some people adapt by becoming emotional translators. They learn to read the moods, tones, and subtle cues of those around them with remarkable precision, adjusting their own behavior to avoid triggering tension. This skill can be so finely tuned that it borders on the intuitive, noticing the slight tightening of a jaw, the shift in breathing, the faintest change in voice. In the gaslighting home, this vigilance helps you sidestep confrontations or preempt situations where your reality might be challenged. Outside of that context, however, it can morph into people-pleasing, over-accommodation, or an inability to assert your own needs for fear of disrupting someone else's emotional balance. Then there is the survival mechanism of mental compartmentalization. This involves splitting off parts of your inner life into safe, untouchable spaces. You might have one version of yourself that exists in the home, careful, agreeable, non-confrontational, and another that exists in private moments or in the company of trusted friends. This internal division can help preserve your sense of identity when the home's dominant narrative tries to overwrite it. However, if the split becomes too deep or too long-lasting, it can create a persistent feeling of disconnection, as though you are always playing a role and never fully inhabiting your own life. Some people turn to external anchors of reality to counteract the constant distortion inside the home. This might take the form of journaling, keeping voice memos, or documenting events in ways that can be referred to later. These records serve as a personal archive, a reminder that what you saw, heard, and felt actually happened. While this can be a powerful act of resistance in the moment, it can also reinforce the habit of looking outside yourself for confirmation of what's real, which makes rebuilding internal trust more challenging later on. Humor can also emerge as a coping mechanism, though it is often a carefully crafted one. In some households, deflecting tension with a joke can temporarily shift the emotional atmosphere, providing a brief reprieve from conflict or scrutiny. This humor is rarely random. It is strategically deployed, calibrated to land without inviting further criticism. Over time, the ability to use wit as a shield becomes second nature, but it can also become a mask, concealing pain or vulnerability that never feels safe to reveal. For others, withdrawal becomes the default response. This can take the form of physically retreating to a private space whenever tension rises, or mentally checking out of conversations that feel like traps. While withdrawal can minimize immediate harm, it can also lead to a pattern of disengagement from life in general, where stepping back feels safer than risking being misunderstood or invalidated. The important thing to understand about these coping mechanisms is that they are not flaws. They are solutions crafted under pressure, often in childhood, or during vulnerable times when there were no better options available. In the gaslighting household, they were adaptive and necessary. The challenge comes later, in recognizing when they are no longer serving you, and in learning how to reshape them into strengths. Hypercompetence, for example, can be transformed into healthy conscientiousness, the ability to be thorough without falling into perfectionism. Emotional translation skills can evolve into empathy that is paired with clear boundaries, allowing you to be attuned to others without losing yourself in their needs. Strategic silence can become mindful communication, where you choose when and how to share without feeling silenced by fear. Even withdrawal, when reframed, can become a conscious act of self-care, used to create space for reflection rather than as a habitual escape. Transforming these coping strategies requires environments that are fundamentally different from the ones in which they formed. It demands relationships where honesty is safe, mistakes are treated as opportunities to learn rather than weapons to be used against you, and differences in perception are discussed rather than denied. The process can be slow and uneven, but each time you successfully use one of these skills in a healthier way, you reclaim a piece of yourself from the grip of the old environment. Recovery from the effects of a gaslighting household is rarely a single, triumphant moment. It is almost never a case of walking out the front door one day, breathing in fresh air, and immediately feeling whole again. More often, it's a slow, uneven, and sometimes painful reclamation of the parts of yourself that were chipped away by years of distortion. It unfolds in stages that may overlap, repeat, or stall, depending on your circumstances, your support system, and your own readiness to face the truths you've been taught to doubt. The earliest stage often begins with a flicker of recognition, an unsettling moment when you realize that the way you've been treated is not in fact normal. This might come from reading an article, hearing someone else's story, or watching a film that reflects your own experience back at you in ways you had never put into words. Sometimes it's sparked by a single incident at home that is so blatantly contradictory or cruel that it pierces the fog you've been living in. That flicker doesn't always lead to immediate change, but it plants a seed of doubt about the narratives you've been fed, which is ironic given that gaslighting thrives by making you doubt yourself. This time, the doubt is pointed outward. Following that first recognition, many people enter a phase of quiet observation. They start noticing patterns, how certain topics always lead to denial, how their words are subtly rephrased before being repeated, how they feel tense in certain rooms or at certain times of day. This stage can be both validating and destabilizing. On one hand, you finally see the mechanics of what's been happening to you. On the other, you realize just how pervasive it is. Some people keep mental or written records during this time, not necessarily to confront anyone, but to strengthen their grip on their own reality. The next stage often involves seeking external validation. This might mean confiding in a trusted friend, therapist, or online support group. For someone who has been conditioned to doubt their perceptions, hearing another person say, "That's not okay," or "That happened to me too," can be a revelation. It helps bridge the gap between knowing something is wrong and believing that you have the right to call it wrong. But this step also carries risks, especially if you are still living in the gaslighting environment, and disclosure could reach the wrong ears. The act of telling your story requires courage, and the responses you receive can either bolster your confidence or set you back if they are dismissive. Once you begin to believe your own experiences, a critical shift happens. You start experimenting with boundaries. In the context of a gaslighting household, boundaries can be subtle, changing the subject when certain topics arise, spending less time in shared spaces, keeping certain aspects of your life private. In some cases, boundaries become more direct, like refusing to engage in conversations that twist your words or openly challenging false statements. These early boundaries are often fragile, prone to collapse under pressure, but each attempt reinforces the idea that you have the right to protect your mental and emotional space. It is around this point that many people face setbacks. Old habits reassert themselves, guilt seeps in, or the household responds with escalated tactics, sharper denials, louder criticisms, more intense pressure to conform. These setbacks can be disheartening, but they are also part of the process. Recovery from gaslighting is not linear, because the patterns it instills are deeply ingrained. Falling back into old responses doesn't mean you've failed. It means you're learning how to apply new strategies in an environment designed to make you abandon them. Eventually, if circumstances allow, a person may reach a stage of physical or emotional separation from the gaslighting household. This doesn't always mean moving out. Sometimes it's about building an inner space that is off limits to manipulation. Other times it does involve a literal move, finding a new place to live, even if it's a small imperfect space that offers more freedom than the polished rooms of the old house. The first days or weeks away can be surprisingly disorienting. Without the constant push and pull of the household's emotional climate, there is a kind of silence that feels both liberating and unnerving. This is where the deeper work of rebuilding begins. You start relearning what it feels like to trust your own perceptions without needing them confirmed. You experiment with expressing opinions without rehearsing them for acceptability. You revisit old interests or try new activities, not to please anyone else, but to see how they feel to you. Some of these experiments will be awkward. Others will spark a sense of joy or curiosity you forgot you could feel. There is also a grieving process in this stage. Grief for the years spent doubting yourself, for the relationships that were shaped by manipulation, for the home you wanted, but never had. Allowing yourself to feel that grief is an important part of letting go of the old reality. It is a way of acknowledging that what happened to you was real, and that your longing for something better was valid all along. Over time, the coping mechanisms you once used for survival can begin to evolve into skills that serve you in healthier contexts. Hypervigilance can become emotional awareness, strategic silence can become mindful communication, compartmentalization can become a balanced ability to shift between different roles without losing your sense of self. The difference now is that these skills are under your control, used when you choose, rather than dictated by the emotional currents of a household designed to undermine you. The final stage, if there is such a thing, is not about erasing the past but integrating it. You may never completely forget the way your house once gaslighted you, but you can reach a point where those experiences no longer define you. You carry them as part of your story, but not as the central chapter. The space you inhabit now, whether physical, emotional, or both, is one you've built with intention, filled with cues that affirm rather than distort your reality.